Welcome to the Good Leadership Podcast, where we discuss research-backed strategies and techniques with recognized thought leaders that will deliver results that matter and create lasting change for leaders at all levels. Well, welcome to this episode of the Good Leadership Podcast. Today, I'm glad to be joined by Dr. Paul Zak, who is a professor at Claremont Graduate University and is ranked in the top 0.3% of most cited scientists with over 180 published papers and more than 19,000 citations to his credit. And his first 2 decades of research has taken him from the Pentagon to Fortune 50 boardrooms to the rainforest of Papua New Guinea. And along the way, he has helped to start a number of interdisciplinary fields, including neuroeconomics, neuromanagement, and neuromarketing. His latest book, which will be the topic of today's episode, Immersion, The Science of Extraordinary and Source of Happiness, identifies the neurologic basis for extraordinary experiences by using over 50,000 brain measurements to show readers how to create high-impact marketing, entertainment, training, customer services, and employee experiences. Welcome to the program, Paul.
Thanks so much, Charles.
I always like to start each episode with a little bit of background about you. What got you interested in this topic, and what was the reason for you writing this book?
So in the early 2000s, I did some of the early work on the behavioral effects of oxytocin, and that was to address the small question that most scientists haven't thought about, like the nature of good and evil. So what's that inflection point that causes us to go from being wonderful, warm people to being occasionally unmitigated jerks, and vice versa? If nature is really red in tooth and claw, why aren't we as humans constantly stealing, murdering, hurting other people? And so it turns out that oxytocin is this core component. I've called it a moral molecule. It increases our empathy for others. And when we have empathy, if I were to hurt you, Charles, I would feel your pain, and I don't like pain. And so that helps to motivate me to behave nicely in others. And again, knowing the neurologic mechanisms allows us to ask what inhibits or promotes these mechanisms to activate in the brain. And we get this very rich understanding of good and bad. So the new work, Immersion, came out of that, in which we were tasked by the US Department of Defense as part of the War on Terror to identify combinations of signals in the brain that would accurately and consistently predict what people would do after a message or an experience. So we burned millions of dollars of taxpayer money and basically built a neurologic prediction engine that led us to capture this neurologic state of called immersion, which appears to be the brain's valuation mechanism for experiences. So when those experiences are valued, then we perform them better as employees, we enjoy them more as customers, and it creates a craving to repeat those experiences. So that means drives up customer lifetime value. So again, I'm a very practical neuroscientist, right? I'm actually trying to find mechanisms that allow me to then generalize and share that information with others.
Thank you for providing that background. You mentioned the first step in engineering these amazing experiences is to identify how the brain differentiates between the extraordinary and the ordinary. Could you unpack that a little bit for us and just give us some indication of how that's done?
Right. So you've been to the DMV. How's that experience for you?
Not very
Right.
good.
So yeah, I mean, part of that's because it's a monopoly and it's hard to fire government workers, right? So, and yet, sometimes when you go to a high-end store, the experience is either mundane or frustrating. So, what is that about? And I think one reason for that is that people lie, right? If I give you a survey a day or 2 or 3 after whatever event you went to, how'd you like it? You're like, I don't know. Either you kind of love it or hate it. So we have what I call the Freudian hangover. We think from this drug addict Freud that if I just ask you the right kind of question, I make unconscious conscious. And that's not true, right? Those are separate data streams, and most of what your brain's doing is unconscious. So if we want to capture the valuation for extraordinary experiences, we have to be able to tap into those unconscious emotional responses. So what we found in these many years of research, all published, people can download it for free, is that you need 2 things to capture that valuation mechanism in the human brain. One is I've got to be attentive, right? So if I'm not present, if I'm distracted looking at something else, I'm not going to have a great conversation with you, Charles. So that's just the table stakes. It just gets me in the ball game. But the second is I've got to actually get sufficient emotional value from that. I call it emotional resonance. It's got to be meaningful to me. I'll give you a concrete example. I was getting on an airplane one morning, And I just happened it was cold. So I had like this sweatshirt, like camo sweatshirt. I didn't serve in the military, although it worked a lot with them. But anyway, it's not a U.S. military sweatshirt. And literally, without looking up, the flight attendant said, "Thank you for your service, sir." And just like literally didn't make any contact. Just saw this camo sweatshirt. I'm like, "You suck." Like that's not. She's not excited about work. She's not making eye contact with me, and she certainly hasn't spent any energy to assess whether it was in the military or not. Right. So it really ruined the entire experience versus recently I was on a 15-hour flight home from Cape Town, South Africa. I had one of the world's best flight attendants, same airline, which I won't, well, I'll mention it, United Airlines. And this guy like was so nice, smiled. 15-hour flight, right? That's a long damn flight. And he got there early and, this guy was so attentive, got the meal I wanted, couldn't be nicer, didn't bother me, but also almost like appeared when I needed a new drink. Like he was paying attention. This guy loved his job, right? So now I remember that, right? 15 damn hour flight out of a 30-hour flight coming home. This guy was memorable. So do I want to talk about United Airlines? Of course I do, right? It was amazing. So that's the difference, right? And so if we can create these extraordinary experiences, then they're saved in memory in a very particular way that might make them more easily accessible. And that's what helps create that craving to repeat them. So now next time I go to South Africa, hopefully, and if a choice of airlines, I'm like, wow, 15 damn hours on an airplane and United was extraordinary. Why don't I just do that again?
I love how you break it down between those two. That attention is the first step. You have to have the attention. It's a binary function. So either you have it or you don't, and you lose it pretty quickly. So you have to engage it within that first 15 to 30 seconds. But really, it's the emotional resonance throughout the experience that's going to determine how immersive it is, how engaging it is, along with a few other factors that we'll get into later in the conversation. So, love those two pieces of it. I also really enjoyed kind of reading in your book with that businesses, everyone wants this, right? I mean, you've consulted with a myriad of different industries, with different businesses. They love to tap into this power. It's difficult to do. You even give some stats, which I think are pretty sobering, that every day there's 24,000 new songs that are released. 95% of them stream 10 times or less. In Hollywood, there's 786 movies released per year. Only 20% of them earn a profit. 65% of TV shows cancel within the first season. And probably these numbers are not as accurate as they could be in today's age, but it paints a very vivid picture, right? The most creative content, which I love this statement, it's pretty common sense, is simply not good enough to gain an audience. And I think that's what people really need to hear. Give us some more detail regarding that misattribution of arousal and those liking ratings that you kind of alluded to, and really why they aren't very good predictors.
Right. So if liking predicted, then everything would be a hit because we just asked people what they like. But to me, it's the wrong question, right? So I want to know: did this shake up your brain so much that again it creates that emotional resonance, that craving to repeat it, that desire to talk about it, right? All the things that we want from extraordinary experience. So again, we've got to tap into those unconscious emotional experiences. So one of the kind of open questions that you suggested, Charles, is how the hell does anybody measure 50,000 brains? And we did that by creating a software platform that infers brain activity from the brain's output file, the cranial nerves, and we can pull that data from smartwatches and fitness sensors. And so we have a army of people who subscribe to our software platform that are measuring extraordinary experiences every day. And although they own that data, sometimes they share it with me to get more insights. And so, yeah, so if you're a creative person, it is hard. Let's be really clear. It's super hard. Think of, the Rolling Stones, been around for 60 years. How do they do it? Right now, you may say their heyday was in the 80s or something, but still, they're still together. Um, it's extraordinarily hard to create something that is extraordinary. So to do that, I think having technology like we've developed particularly gives people with less experience a leg up. So the Rolling Stones have played, who knows, 100,000 gigs. They've learned every trick. They're getting feedback as they vary things a little bit in each concert. But if you're just starting out as a musician, or for that matter, managing other humans, direct reports or creating customer experiences, you don't know, or you're just kind of guessing. And guessing is not a great strategy. So we've really got to measure. And for me, going out of the lab and just doing small scale studies that we publish, which is exciting, but having this technology be available so that the DMV can be a great experience, so that when I walk into Walmart, I actually have a really good time and not just get the world's cheapest stuff, right? So that's kind of where we're going. So let me give you a concrete example. Publicly, Accenture is a longtime user of the platform. Accenture last year revenue was around $16 billion. They spend about $1 billion annually on upskilling their employees, so corporate training. And what they found by measuring immersion during those trainings, and immersion correlates with information recall, right? It's being saved in memory effectively, is that people cannot stay immersed in training for more than 20 minutes. Interesting. So they started breaking down their training modules into 20-minute chunks. So that could be no one speaks for more than 20 minutes, like a facilitator, and then say 20 minutes of table work, and then maybe 20 minutes of a debrief. They found that breaks need to be longer because immersion is metabolically costly. It fatigues those neurons. So that's a very empirical, data-driven approach to optimizing corporate training rather than the thing that you and I have gotten, Charles, many times, which is that survey you get after you get home. They say, how was the lunch? Did you like the keynote speaker? I don't care. I think the ROI from training is, did that information stick in your brain so you can create value for the organization? And the cool thing is that highly immersive experiences are also really enjoyable. They turn us on, they're exciting, they're emotionally valuable to us. And so there's a real win-win space there. And so I think what's been missing has been a measurement tool. And once we have that, we can ask all kinds of questions about kind of A/B testing, tweaking things. So I'm moving up that immersion ladder and creating better experiences for everybody.
Well, and it allows you to look underneath the hood, because the eye-opening thing for me, and there was many eye-opening parts of the book for me, but one of them was the fact that we just really don't know what motivates us unconsciously. So we can say something and maybe we're lying because we don't want to hurt someone else's feeling, but really, or it's that peak end rule where we're just judging the experience by what happened in the last part of that experience, but we're really not identifying it moment by moment. Was this experience immersive, engaging, something I'm going to purchase, use in the future, remember, whatever the case may be, because we just don't have access to that information at a conscious level.
And you mentioned the misattribution of arousal. So again, arousal is a physiologic state. If I just do that, I can make your heart rate go up. Doesn't mean you're having a great experience, right? I've just kind of shocked your brainstem. So, if we have these kind of weird arousal points and we think, oh, this must be great, but it could be that a weird bat flew over my head at night, or, there's all kinds of reasons that we have this physiologic arousal. So the father of American psychology, William James, made a differentiation between emotions and feelings. So emotions are the physiologic response. Again, that increase in heart rate when I clap my hands, but feelings are our conscious interpretation of that. And those are actually very poorly linked, except in the extremes. You're super angry. Okay, you get that. You're super in love with the cutest guy or girl. You know that. But, how's my experience right now on a scale 1 to 7? Well, compared to what? Compared to my kids? I forget my kids. They talk back to me. They're terrible. Compared to my dog's perfect, right? My dog's a 7 out of 7. So, if I don't have that objective measurement technology, but, how do I compare talking to you to my dog? I mean, it doesn't make any sense. So we're asking too much of the conscious brain, and that's where technology comes in. And Charles, I'm telling you this as if, and from the book, as if I knew what the hell I was doing for the last 20 years. We tried a ton of things that didn't work. We made a lot of mistakes, and wonderful US taxpayers, spent millions of dollars helping fund our lab. And we're creating technology, that's being used currently by the Department of Defense to train soldiers to be better communicators. So part of this is just communication. Unlike the flight attendant who didn't even make eye contact with me with a camo sweatshirt, just look at me, right? Be present, first of all, and then think about what my needs are, right? I mean, this is not news to anybody, except we tend to do it poorly without having that measurement technology. And so, again, for me, I hate to have bad experiences, right? We all do, but it really drives me nuts when we have these just blah, everything's kind of blah. So I think there's a real differentiator for companies that can create extraordinary experiences for customers. And here's my claim, and I'd love to get your feedback on this. I don't think you can have great CX unless you have great EX. What do you think about that?
I would agree with that. That's not something I'm going to challenge you on, and that transitions well into some of the applications of your research, which there's lots of applications that you share in the book. The first one I like to go over is how do you get people to fall in love with a brand, with a company? And you mentioned two things. Immersive brand stories has to have that narrative arc. And maybe you can speak a little bit about the narrative arc that's so essential and with anything if you want to have an immersive experience. And then second is inviting super fans. So maybe we can unpack that as well in identifying actually who those people are so we can engage those individuals earlier rather than later.
And let me show you my live data right now. So I'm a whatever that is. So I'm a little bit going down. So I have a little frown, a little below baseline that frown. But my background is winter. I'm a little bit stressed because I'm talking to you. I'm putting effort in. But you'll see that I'm getting data second by second. There's going up 41, right? I'm getting more value from this. So I can actually see what parts of my day are best. What am I really getting value from? What do I care about? So think of this as happiness is in the subtitle of the book, right? So that's kind of where it's going. Okay, so let's talk about narratives and about superfans. So we have looked at just thousands of experiences, and what we discovered was the most effective way to sustain immersion is to use a narrative arc when I communicate, right? Or when I create a customer journey, have that be a narrative arc. So what's a narrative arc? So I introduce characters at human scale, right? Not at macro scale, not a million people. It's one or two people. Put them in a setting that's unusual. So now I'm interested as a social creature, and then have them display authentic emotions when they generally faced a crisis. They have to resolve that crisis by making some kind of decisions, and then that narrative concludes. And so that narrative arc that builds that emotional tension keeps us expending the metabolic energy to process the entire experience. And that's why immersion strongly predicts things like hit songs, as you kind of suggested earlier, predicts sales in retail, predicts movie ticket sales, and on and on and on, because it's capturing the holy crap approach. And I think what's interesting about this is there's this emerging approach in neuroscience called brain as predictor, and that's a technology, or that's an approach that we help pioneer and others have as well, which I can measure brain activity from a moderate number of people, like 30 or 40 people, and predict market outcomes, because the signals we're getting from the brain are deep in the brainstem and they're very consistent across individuals. So I don't need to measure 1,000, US adults to figure out if my movie's going to be great. I can actually measure 35 or 40 of them and capture that experience. So we have had a number of movie studios use our technology. As you know, there's a whole chapter on entertainment, and really crafting that narrative arc by measuring immersion second by second, say for theatrical trailers for movies, is really an effective way to create that craving to actually find out what happens to these characters that you're setting up this. In case of a movie trailer, half of a narrative arc, right? You have to buy a ticket to find out how it resolves. And then secondly, oftentimes we'll see experiences or messages that are just okay, and yet there's going to be a core group of people who are immersion super fans. They are like two standard deviations above the mean. They dig this. And so sometimes if you've already invested in an experience or a message, it may just be okay. But if you can capture those super fans, they love it so much. Not only will they act on what you've asked them to do, they will spread the word for you. This is word of mouth, right? Social proof. So they want to be activated. Whatever this is, they are loving it. And so finding these people demographically, if not individually, and asking them to help you is a great way to take an okay message or experience and make it really generate lots of revenue for you, because these people will actually engage in the experience over and over, share it with others. And so those super fans are super valuable. Now you can find them if you have, all the movie studios have fandom departments now, right? So you can find them, they're writing fan fiction. Great, that's wonderful. But if you can find them in the early testing phases and say, oh, it's actually Latina females between 25 and 40 who are just over the moon about this neurologically. Let's play some ads in, I don't know, Univision, or, wherever people in that demographic are going to watch that, and ask them and even incentivize them to help you spread the word.
Great insights there. You mentioned in the book too, and I love talking about trailers because I didn't realize the importance trailers have in movie ticket sales until I was reading this, and how they can redo trailers depending on the audience reviews, and they have different trailers in different markets. And really some of the highlights of what you mentioned in the book were, with the Paramount team, to increase immersion, build strong narrative arcs, strong storyline, bring that tension as quickly as possible, put more focus on the human protagonists, the people versus the things or the animals or the monsters, whatever that genre might be. And then, add close up of faces of humans so that you can see kind of their emotions during it and leave it. Don't finish that narrative arc, leave it at a high tension point to really attract people to want to go see the movie because so much of the movie studios gets the majority of their revenue in the first few weeks of that production, right?
Yeah, exactly right. It's a sliding scale. Discussed in the book also work we did for the state of California on the health insurance exchange that was set up under Obamacare. And the commercials were literally didn't it was neck down. They had people moving around. They didn't show faces at all. I'm like, who made this? Like who thought this was a good idea? Right. And poor narrative arc, no crisis, no emotion, and certainly no faces. So there's a bunch of hacks in the book. Every chapter ends with some hacks. One is, as you said, zoom in on the face, right? I'm showing emotion. I'm gonna capture that if I'm watching it. So the really weird or interesting thing about immersion is it's contagious. So if I'm able to explain, have an immersive state, if I display that emotion, you're going to pick up on that generally. And so there's really kind of three dimensions that listeners can think about that can be used to tap into immersion to influence other people's behaviors. One is first establishing psychological safety. That's the presence, right? Sometimes we think we should rush in. Hey, I'm trying to tell you something. I don't want to waste your time. No, settle down. Hey, Charles, how are you? Nice to see you. Hey, use your name. That's great. I'm Paul. I'm going to tell you about our new product. Would you like a cup of coffee? Have a seat. Oh, wow. Use my name. This is the flight attendant on United from South Africa. Knew my name, right? Just relax. Everything's going to be great. 15 hours together. It's going to be cool. We're going to take care of you. Oh, okay. Now I feel good. So first is establish psychological safety. The second is now, give me a reason to care about this, right? So if you structure that content, little pieces, but more intensive, emotionally intensive, like the 2020 rule of Accenture, if you really create a narrative arc where you're telling me what's happening, you're showing me using a story how this is going to happen, even if you can show me technical information later, start with a story. We all understand stories. And the third is the way you deliver it. So that's the contagion effect. So I may be telling you the most interesting thing ever, Charles, perhaps like right now. But if I speak in a monotone, man, you're just going to go to sleep, right? So three things that people can control. One is establish psychological safety. Second, use a narrative arc, tell a story. Always lead with a story, even if you're going to add technical stuff. And third, deliver it with passion, with energy, right? So that's the EX part. If that employee is not excited about customer-facing interactions, why should the customer be excited? You're like, oh, you've done this 100 million times and you don't care. But that's the first flight attendant who I saw who was just checked out.
Great stuff. You also identify in that chapter low points of immersion, which you call frustration, and you have a way to measure those. So those are minimized, right? And those immersive peaks are sustained. Perhaps you can talk a little bit more about that. And then the other surprising part of this chapter or this piece of the book is that you can't sustain these immersive experiences for very long, less than a minute. So just the audience needs to realize, or the creators, the company, the content creator needs to realize that, so they have multiple arcs going at one time so they can give people breaks. So let's first talk about those frustration points and what those really kind of mean and how you can minimize those.
Yeah, it's an old saying about the stock market to cut your losses early and let your winners run, right? So the same thing with immersion, right? So once you have these data and you see these low points where I'm attentive, but I'm not getting an emotional value from it, that's what I call frustration. I'm here, it's just not working for me. And so I want to try to minimize those, except and let the peaks, extend. So if I have let's say I have a commercial and I have a great close up of your face, it's a great story, perfect branding moment, by the way. That's what you're going to remember. That's that emotional high arousal state. So, but I want to extend that. So when we look at, I've just seen thousands of commercials with neurologic data, oftentimes there's this peak moment and then disappears, or they don't do the branding, and then the branding's at the end when immersion's low. So, really let those peak experiences run. So because immersion is metabolically costly, as you suggested, these data are always kind of a sine wave, up and down, up and down. So the longest peaks I've ever seen for 50,000 plus brains is about 45 seconds, really like just grinding it. And most peaks are more like 5 to 10 seconds. So I'm really in. And then my neurons fatigue, I got to take a little break. So as you suggested, Charles, I want to kind of curate this experience to have some peak moments and then a little bit of break. If it's a longer experience, as longer means maybe 10 minutes or longer, then I want to think about having maybe multiple different stories going on multiple different parts of the experience. So there's a discussion there of me taking my team to Disneyland and measuring immersion on a bunch of rides. And oftentimes, for people who've been at Disneyland or Disney World, queuing up is actually more immersive, I mean, on measurement than is the ride itself. So an example would be Space Mountain, which is a roller coaster in the dark for people who haven't been on it. But it's this big display, and you're being, transited through all these, this kind of rat maze, but it's all exciting and there's screens and there's noise and there's things happening and it's setting up that you're going to be on a spaceship. And it's really fun. And then when you get there, it's just a roller coaster in the dark. There's not so much you can do with the ride. So it's that anticipation, that cueing of this experience, the setting up the story. And that's the brilliance of Disney is wrapping these basically simple rides in a very rich story structure so that you feel kind of sucked in and you really drive up that immersion. And so I think that's a general rule, right? I want to kind of set this up so that when you get this extraordinary experience, it's really a peak moment and allowing a little bit of these troughs where you can just kind of rest, take it easy. So I don't want to hit you all the time and keep you at peak immersion. We see this in surveys, right? So I'm just looking for prop. How much do I like this drink? 10 out of 10. It's awesome. Doesn't happen in the brain, right? I might take a drink and maybe it's a 10 and then I'm going to have a little. So really think about curating that pattern, but having that peak uh, moment occur when it's most valuable to the customer, not the company, the customer. Because if it's valuable to the customer, it'll be valuable to the company, right? That's what's going to happen. So really think about where you want that customer to be. Where's that decision point? Where is that takeoff point? So that that customer has this amazing experience right when you want them to buy something or experience this thing or remember this information if you're in training. So really think about curating that experience. And that's where, our intuition is not terrible. I'm not saying people are not smart, but sort of second by second, it's pretty hard to know without some measurement tool.
Well, once you have that measurement tool, then you can identify where to put the calls to action. Because I hear that, or I see that a lot in commercials and advertising. They always put it at the end, and that's not necessarily the immersion peak that they're looking for. It'd be better to put it throughout or at certain places within and make sure there's that strong product story congruence throughout so that there was one Super Bowl commercial that I was reading in another book in 2000. It had a lot of people watching it during the Super Bowl. It was where a band was out on the field and a wolf pack came out and started to attack them. And everyone was kind of talking about it the next day, but they couldn't remember the product of that commercial. So it really wasn't strongly tied to the underlying story, which was emotionally impactful and people remembered it. But you definitely want your product to be part of that story that people are talking about the next day.
Yeah, exactly. So, spray paint on that fake wolf, the logo of the company or the name or something. So you cue these. I was just looking up, not a user of the platform, a Bass Pro Shop commercial recently. Great Super Bowl commercial as well. That's why I thought of it. And it's really great. You have this peak immersion moment. And there's about a 1 second view of, these are destination shopping, right? The front of the store was very fast, maximum 1 second. And then the immersion started to fall as the story began to conclude. Linger on that, right? That is the branding moment. You've got me captured. Show that storefront for 3 seconds, 4 seconds. Let that winner ride.
Absolutely. We talked about a little bit about the learning and the training and delivery piece, but I'd like to go into a little more detail now because everyone's wanting to learn more effectively, remember what they've learned, and you remember your phone number, your address, your social security for decades. But a lot of the books that you read, the training that you take, the development opportunities you have is in one ear out the other. You quickly forget them based on the forgetting curve. And part of that is these aren't emotional memories. These aren't something that are going to pique your immersion. And in the book, you talk about three things. You talk about content can be done better, the delivery, but also the readiness to learn measure, which you kind of alluded to prior. But I'd love for you to unpack that more for our listeners and giving that psychological safety and why it's so important to create an immersive learning experience.
Yeah, a couple of interesting things on that. That's a great question, Charles. Thank you. All of us here have learned by going to school forever how to sit on our butts for 8 or 10 hours a day. Sure, I can do it. Doesn't mean it's the most effective way for me to do work or to remember information. So a couple kind of takeaways there. One is we need people to be comfortable. So, if you're in a room that's too cold or too hot, or your butt hurts from sitting for so long, or you have to pee, or you're hungry, that's taking neural bandwidth. So that diminishes my psychological safety. And that reduction in neural bandwidth means I have less brain power to be immersed in the experience. So again, the takeaway here is frequent, shorter trainings, more intensive, longer breaks. They give me a chance to refresh, but then hit me hard. So, for example, if I do corporate trainings, I will do an afternoon with a bunch of breaks, say 4 hours, and then give you homework overnight so the brain consolidates information while you sleep. And then in the morning, do another 4 hours. If it's an 8 hour training, I'm going to break it up, right? So even better if I do an hour for 8 different days, but usually I'm flying in somewhere and that's not feasible. So when I do presentations, when I train, I will mix up using that 20-20-20 rule. So for listeners, a lot of people do training, a lot of people lead teams. Really think about that hard 20-minute change, and then I'll show a video or I'll ask the audience for questions. I'll take a break. I've had people stand up and exercise. Let's all do jumping jacks, and everyone laughs. It's all goofy. It's stupid. But then we're all kind of relaxed again. We've increased that psychological safety, give our brains a little bit of break. And so all those kind of funny things that seem like time wasting are actually refreshing from a neurologic perspective and will increase the impact of the experience you're creating.
Well, this can be done in a training, but this can also be done learning individually, having that 20-20-20 rule where 20 minutes of going through the content, 20 minutes of application, seeing how to apply it, maybe 20 minutes of debrief, and then take a break for 20 minutes. So essential. And it's really so much more effective to do it that way than to try to do these long training and development or reading a book for 5 or 6 hours. Because I find from talking to a lot of leaders, they read a lot of books, but they're hard pressed to identify really what they remember and what they're applying from those books. And this to me is a more digestible, scientifically proven framework that gets you one, that readiness to learn, whether it's individually or in a training. But then once you're there, here's a process you can use that's going to make it more effective.
I think from both a training and even a customer service perspective, think of just one thing that you want this person to take away from this, right? So if it's an hour, I want to have you read one thing. I have a big lab. I have graduate students. We write lots of scientific papers. And literally, I have to train them. Like, what is the number one thing? What's the headline? The New York Times calls you. What's the 5-word sentence that you want people to know from this paper? And they will bury that in all kinds of things because they're very technical and they're very excited about what they're doing. But make it simple, right? Really think about here is the most important thing that you need to know. And if I can craft that in an experience that emotionally compelling, right? So I can get you to care about it. Like, this is important, and here's why. Here's why it's important for you. Another thing, Charles, and we sort of glossed over this, but when we look at things like superfans, it means even if I'm using a story structure, a narrative structure to convey information, there's not one perfect story for everybody, right? Because stories resonate based on our own experience, our memories, where we grew up, all these things. Really think about crafting separate stories for separate audiences, right? So it doesn't mean every time I give a talk, I'm giving the same talk. I'm really thinking about that audience. I think about what's most valuable to them, and then thinking about that one thing I want them to know, and maybe two, subsidiary things. And so really kind of simplify it. And it sounds like we're talking to third graders, but our brains are kind of third grader brains, right? They're really not able to capture all this information, as you said, very effectively. I can read a whole book, but what are the one or two things I should really take away from that?
How about things that go viral? You talk about it with TED Talks that go viral. Could you give some insights into what are those characteristics of whether it's a video, whether it's a talk, because everyone's trying to be a content creator these days and looking for ways in which to capture a greater audience?
Right. So again, it's really using that narrative structure. So the TED folks, as everyone knows, there's 18-minute maximum talk. So they somehow discovered the 20-20-20 rule on their own. Good for them. The second is really crafting that information so that it is emotionally compelling, and there's almost always a call for action in these talks, right? So if I'm just entertaining you, that's totally fine if I'm going to the movies or the theater. But if I'm trying to convey information that affects your behavior, and that's my world, right? Influence, then I really want to have that call to action occur in the peak of that story arc, right? If possible. If that happens, then I'm much more likely to move it. And so we find in TED Talks is that narrative arc, that authentic emotion, being open on the stage, being authentic is what draws us in. That's what increases that emotional resonance and drives up immersion. Where the very few views of TED Talks, the TED Talks are very flat, have a very flat structure. I did this, I did that. They're often chronological. By the way, I'm the last person you want to go to the TED conference with. I've been to zillions, and I'll just sit there and critique people because I've seen so many of them and measured so many of them. So oftentimes we think, well, if I'm telling my story, I should tell it chronologically. No, do a hot open. I'm already sitting in the chair. I'm already relaxed. I'm half asleep. Hit me hard, right? Tell me like the most exciting thing I've ever seen in my entire life is talking to Charles Good. This is going to be a crazy good experience. Oh, okay. Well, wow. Charles Good. Yeah, I heard of this guy. He's supposed to be awesome, right? So really, but then you gotta bring it. If you're gonna say that, you gotta bring it. So, really got to kind of set this up. So don't think that the narrative arc doesn't need to start slow, right? Hit me hard right away, get me going, get that attentional response, and then make me care about what's happening. And that's what we see when we break down from the neurologic data second by second. It's really this very clear narrative arc. And again, almost always a call to action at the end.
Is there any tips that you can give our listeners regarding that narrative arc and storytelling? Is it the hero's journey? Is there certain things that they should make sure they include within that narrative structure of a story?
Yeah, I mean, there's an argument that there's only one classic story structure, and the hero's journey is basically that story structure. That's a very tried and true structure. I think what we find in the corporate setting is if I can identify at human scale a problem that someone is facing, could be an employee, could be a customer, we all understand that because we've been in similar situations. And so by identifying an individual and often by name, right? So I had a customer named Bob Smith. He loved this car, couldn't afford it. What do we do? Oh, okay. Well, I can imagine that situation. I grew up poor. I had a lot of cars I wanted to buy I couldn't afford. Right. So then now I've set up this little crisis that we all understand. Right. So, or it could be an employee. Hey, this employee, Mary Smith, she worked here for 20 years. She was ready for a promotion and she turned it down. And that surprised us. Why would you turn down a promotion? More responsibility, more pay. And so we talked to Mary, and Mary worked on the phones and she loved helping people. And then we realized, hey, just because you've been here a long time doesn't mean that you have to have a new job. We should actually have an opportunity for people to develop their careers without having to accept more responsibility. And maybe we should pay them for that because they have so much knowledge. They're experts in their area. So again, we can all kind of grab onto that, right? So that kind of very focused story. So really think from the audience perspective. So I always think like this with Charles. Before we spoke, I thought about who is the audience? How do I create as much value for them as possible? How do I focus my discussion to create value? So sometimes we do a lot of public speaking, you and I both do, and others who are listening do. We really think about, oh, I'm so excited about the new thing I'm doing. I want to share it with everybody. But I really want to flip that. And I think by having a measurement technology that allows me to measure what those other people are doing, it gets me out of my head from this is the most exciting thing for me, as opposed to what is valuable to you. And I think that's really the key. What does that listener, reader, customer, employee really need to know to enliven their lives, to give them that emotional value? And I'm just going to go for one more minute, if I may. And that's why happiness is in the book. What we find is that when people have a lot of these peak immersion experiences, it looks like they've trained their brain to be more present, more emotionally open. And we have published research showing that they have improved health spans. They live longer, they live healthier, they live happier because they are either creating or part of deeply immersive experiences. And those are almost always service experiences, right? That's volunteering. I mean, we're all in the service business. I think I can't think of any job that's not a service job. So we're all helping other people, but realizing the impact we have on individuals and on and our communities when we embrace that, and particularly when companies help employees understand how valuable they are, not just to their direct customers, but to their employee colleagues, to their communities, to their families, that really makes this more important, more valuable, more immersive. So just to be super clear on that, we've run experiments where we have social purpose, same thing, you're doing the same task. We're paying you, like filling in emails or something, and don't tell you what we're going to pay you is some crappy job. And then same thing, and say, by the way, this is going to help people because we're going to raise money for the university so underprivileged students can attend college. Oh, people are like twice as productive, they enjoy it more, and they work harder, right? So that kind of satisfaction just comes from the way I frame this, but I'm still framing that as a story, right? I'm still talking about, hey, here's a student. His name is I don't know, Jose, and he was an immigrant from Mexico, and he really wants to go to college here, can't afford it. And so if we can raise money by reaching out to alumni, then Jose and students like him can attend our university. Let's work hard to make that happen. Oh, okay, I get it. I'm not just a drone adding in, data without thinking about it. So this is all tapping into our social nature, right? We are social creatures, which means we're helpers. That's back to the early oxytocin work. We're helpers, we're in the helping world, and we generally get a lot of satisfaction from helping others. Lastly, sorry for a long answer, Charles. There's no brainwashing here, right? All this information is available. And if you are making an important decision and you feel like the people you're talking to or have undue influence, slow down. So, as I said earlier, the brain consolidates information overnight. So, before you buy a car, buy a house, get married, get divorced, sleep on it, at least for one night, right? Let that information kind of seep in and get categorized in your brain. Those decisions will be better if you actually take some time and really understand it. And so, yeah, there's no brainwashing, right? I can show you, Charles, the best commercial for Huggies diapers, but if you don't have infants at home, your brain just flushes it out, right? And, it may be amusing to see those babies with big eyes, and that's very cute, but I can't brainwash you to buy something you don't need.
Well, and that's the other piece of the model that we really haven't talked about. Yeah, it's going to capture your attention. It might have that emotional resonance, but if it's not relevant to you, that it's not going to cause you to act upon it and purchase the product or somehow benefit that company. And getting back to what you said, it's so important for companies to realize this. If they can connect the social good they're doing to each employee's jobs, it makes such more impact for that employee, right? The employees feel vested, part of that experience, have greater immersion, greater satisfaction with their work. And you have a great example of a company that does this, Zappos, which is famous for their extraordinary phone service. And they call this the PEC, the personal emotional connection. Love for you to share that story just to give our listeners, the leaders of companies that are listening to this, some insight into what they do to make such a difference.
Great question. So, I've spent a lot of time at Zappos in the early days. And as listeners may know, they have no limit on how long people on the phones can stay talking to customers. And their longest call to date, last I heard, it was over 10 hours. Because someone who just was having a great time, they're not having a crisis. Sometimes they have people having a crisis, but this is like they're just having a great conversation. And so they want you to build those, what they call personal emotional connections. I would call immersion neurologically, that connection with other people. So why would you talk on the phone for 10 hours? What's the ROI from that? They bought one thing or two things or maybe nothing, but you're both from St. Louis, and now you're having this long conversation about how much St. Louis and how great it is and I love barbecue and whatever. What are you doing? You're creating a super fan, right? So you're saying, oh my gosh, I had such a good conversation to this customer. What is that customer going to say when he or she then talks to their friends that night or the next day? Oh my God, I was on the phone with Zappos for 10 hours. I had to go pee twice. It was crazy because the guy was so nice. And I really wanted to find this thing. They didn't have it. They were calling around. We just hung out. They're the best place ever. So now maybe I made a $100 sale from that one customer, but I've created multiples of that in terms of word of mouth. And we know that social proof is the most effective way to promote a product. Now go the other direction, the EX. What's that employee think? Oh, Zappos paid me to hang out with the super cool person from my hometown on the phone for 10 hours. In this case, by the way, their colleagues brought them food. They had to take bathroom breaks. The whole thing, it was just a crazy fun adventure. Now, that doesn't happen very often. Most people are busy and the calls are relatively short. But to enable, to empower employees to think, oh, this is going to be an amazing experience for me and for the customers. That contagion effect I talked about, really important. I'll give you another example, which is a little briefer. Worked with a container store many years ago. So if you guys know the container store, really nice containers, but super great service. And so I gave a talk at the headquarters. They gave me a gift certificate, and I went to buy the world's nicest $100 trash can I've ever owned. And people in the store saw me on video or they saw me in person. I got hugs. They were people were so nice. So they really hired warm people, but also they got so much value from helping me. Oh, I got a $100 gift certificate. I'm not sure what I really need. Oh my gosh, a stainless steel trash can that opens on its own. And like, I would never spend 100. I'm a cheap guy. I wouldn't spend $100 on that. But that gift certificate was so nice. And now I'm such a doofus, Charles. I go to the Container Store. I love going there. The people are wonderful. The stuff is first rate. I'm doing a little commercial for them, but it's really a wonderful place. So it's the experience added on to the product that makes me a loyal customer. And we all want that.
And like you mentioned in the book, for business sales, only 3% of the prospects are really ready to buy a product at any one point in time. So you're going to get a lot of no's, but if repetition's key, but also adding that storytelling structure, social proof, like you mentioned, the likelihood of the sales goes up, and connecting with the customer, even though there's this retail apocalypse happening. If you create these memorable and engaging customer experiences, you're going to be able to curb that effect, like some businesses have already done with the Apple stores and what they've done with their retail experience that really kind of changes and breaks the mold of what you typically find with other retailers.
Exactly right. So I think, the retail apocalypse is certainly happening, but still, the majority of sales, 80%, still happen in retail, which is kind of amazing to me. So if that's the case, then let's make that experience, which is different than online, really great. I think part of that is also small footprint retail stores. We're seeing, we don't need the giant stores anymore, and a bigger emphasis on customization at scale. So I think there's such a role here for technology, not just measuring immersion, but knowing if you're a return customer, right? If I'm a return customer, when I visit my elderly father, I stay in the same hotel. I've stayed there for years and years. Literally every time I check in, they're like, "Oh, welcome to our hotel. Let me tell you about the amenities." And they don't say, "Hey, welcome, Dr. Zach. How nice to see you again." That's what should be happening, right? Now it's a medium level hotel, but like, "We're so happy you're back. Where'd you drive in from today?" Like, just that small level of customization that says they don't have a good CRM. That's the problem. I should pop up. Regular customer comes every 3 months, right? There should be some pop up. But just think about that again, without having to measure immersion. Think about customizing that experience, using your name, making eye contact, right? Don't look at the pad. Don't go, "Okay, I'm checking you. Hi, thanks for coming to our hotel. I think you've been here before, right? You look familiar. Oh, yeah, I can see you were here 3 months ago. How come you come so often? Oh, your dad lives here. Awesome. Hey, that's great. How old is he? Blah, blah, blah. Right. So now I feel like, oh, this is my homey place. Right. So that's what we want to feel. We want to feel like we're cared for. We're still paying for the service. I don't mind paying for that, but I want to feel like, again, that wonderful flight attendant on United who really seemed to love his job and cared about me and cared for me, so that this, arduous kind of long flight was less painful.
Absolutely. And there's certain companies that are great models of this, like Nordstrom, Ritz-Carlton, that take that customer experience to the next level, that can be used as examples of what you can do in any size company really to improve that customer service end of the overall experience. Before we end today's episode, really want to get into one more topic, and that's around influence and persuasion. Because persuasion requires sufficient immersion for a message to really provoke action. And there needs to be contextual relevance, like you state, but you give a nice acronym that I love to unpack, and that's CIRTA, SIRTA, that will help it to be more engaging, more influential, more persuasive in your messaging with leaders at all levels.
Yeah. So the CERTA algorithm, I can't remember anything, so I have acronyms. So CERTA, SIRTA, is the algorithm for influence or persuasion. S is for staging. That's that established psychological safety, make me comfortable. The I is for immersion. So create an immersive experience, uses storytelling. That could be experiential storytelling as I transit through a store. It could be storytelling at the level of employees. But think about creating that story structure so I understand from a human scale and an emotional scale why I'm doing this thing. R is relevance. You discussed this earlier, Charles. It's that extra processing the brain puts on an information or an experience when that experience is meaningful to me. The T is for finding those superfans. That's for target. So target those superfans, ask them to help you. And then don't forget the call to action, right? It could be implicit. I could just kind of do branding when that's implicit, or it could be explicit. So oftentimes in sales, which I think is everybody, we are shy to do the call for action, right? I really think this is the great, best car for you. What do you think? Let's buy it. Oh, wow. Okay. So don't be shy about the call to action. If you set up all these parts and it's relevant to that person, you should ask them if they want to get this thing, right? Don't feel shy about it. as you said, you've got to actually ask a number of times where people say yes. And I think that's appropriate, again, because particularly if it's a big decision, right? Really think about it. But improving that experience would be great. And as the technology develops, we have geofencing, we know where we are. I can send you pop-ups, right? All kinds of ways to customize experiences for greater immersion at scale. But really think of that CERTA algorithm: staging, immersion, relevance, targeting, and action. That's kind of where the system is leading us to after measuring 50,000 brains. That's the takeaway for listeners.
Thank you for providing that unpacking of that framework. Great framework to use. At the end of every episode, I always like to give a call to action to our listeners. If there's one thing, Paul, that our listeners could do right away to increase their awareness of whether an experience is immersive or not, what would that be?
Yeah, I think really looking at lingering. So that sounds like a weird thing, right? So if people are choosing to spend more time in your experience, it's generally better, unless you're really frustrating the hell out of them and they're sitting in line forever. So, can think of Disneyland. As you're queuing up in this ride in the summer and it's long and maybe hot, you have lots of things for you to see, lots of things to listen, new experiences. You're talking to people. Right. There's a reason those lines snake around, because you get to see other people. You see what they're doing. You get to talk about them. Hey, look at those weird clothes they're wearing. Look at his shoes. So think about time as a indirect measure of immersion. So we've shown, for example, that people will spend more time watching an ad if it's immersive. So the more immersive it is, the more time I spend watching, and the more likely I am to respond to it. And then this second 1.5 is if I hear a lot of this, rustling, feet moving, people are not comfortable, go back to stage one for this CERTA algorithm. Go back, make them comfortable, right? If I've been in the store for more than 20 minutes, give me a glass of water, a cup of coffee. Ask me if I want to sit down. Really think about that comfort, that hominess. So I really feel like this is a place I want to be.
Great advice, Paul. Thank you so much for joining me today. Remind our listeners how they can get in contact with you and learn more about your work.
Perfect. You can find me at getimmersion.com, immersion with an I. More about me personally at pauljzak.com. And happy to correspond. Anybody who's listening here, any friend of Charles is a friend of mine. So feel free to email me if you've got more questions.
If you like this episode, then please share it on social media and consider leaving a review or rating. If there are specific leadership topics or industry leaders you'd like us to feature on the podcast, we are welcome to your suggestions. Remember, knowledge's transformative power is only activated when it is acted upon. So what actions are you going to take on the insights and knowledge shared in this episode?